One of the biggest surprises that came out of the 2023 Eurovision season, for me at least, but I think for many others as well, was definitely the fact that Luxembourg would be returning to the Eurovision Song Contest in 2014, having not participated for 31 years. Fast forward a couple of months and we've now had the national selection. We know who will be going to Eurovision for Luxembourg's great return. But was it all worth it? Was it worth the 31-year wait? Let's try to find out. Luxembourg may be a micro-state, but they have hit it big in Eurovision over the years. They were one of the 7 founding members back in 1956 when the contest first took part. And for a long time, the country was one of the most successful. They've had 5 wins in the contest, with the last one being in 1983. So they are still up there as one of the most winning countries in the history of the contest. 1993 became the last participation so far for Luxembourg, and over the years there's definitely been campaigns and there's definitely been talks to bring Luxembourg back, but the cost of putting on a show, the cost of the participation fee, the logistics of a small country taking part in the Eurovision Song Contest, that has always been the reason behind them not returning. And I get that, because the contest has changed a lot. When Luxembourg, they exited the contest, a lot of changes were going on behind the scenes. This was around the time when the Eastern Bloc was opening up, the Eastern Europe was opening up, and a lot of these countries wanted to participate in Eurovision. We had a lot more countries coming into the contest in the 1990s, and things were definitely shaking up. You know, we had the introduction of the televote there at the end of the 1990s. We had a lot of countries taking part, so many that we ended up having a semi-final for the first time in 2004. And all of these things, all of these big changes to the Eurovision, those actually happened in just the years following Luxembourg's exit. The contest really grew bigger and it became something different, and there's no doubt that it has become more difficult for smaller states to participate in this. It's become more expensive. The idea of hosting a contest has definitely become a lot harder. You can't just host it in a television studio like you could back in the days when Luxembourg did host the contest. But there has been a lot of talks throughout the years about the potential of Luxembourg returning to the contest. They are a legendary country for many, maybe not for people who have started watching Eurovision in the past couple of years and haven't really looked so much into the history of the contest, but for the people who grew up with Eurovision in the 70s, in the 80s, this is a country you remember. This is a country that always would send quality stuff, that would always do well in the contest. And like I said, even won it 5 times. So I think when you look at Eurovision countries not taking part anymore, Luxembourg was always one of those up there that was like, we never thought they would return, but we always wanted them to return. A lot of us did, at least. Even for someone like me who didn't grow up with it, you know, I've looked a lot into the Eurovision history. I've been very interested in the past history of the Eurovision Song Contest, and Luxembourg is definitely one of those countries that I would love to see back, and now we finally have it. One of the things that surprised me the most, if I'm being honest, was that they went for a national selection. I think in the past, I couldn't really find anything to back this up, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's probably not the first time, but it is definitely one of the only times that they've gone for a national selection. In those past years when they used to participate, they did used to go with an internal selection. And something that also surprised me, and I think surprised a lot of other people as well, was that when they actually originally launched this selection process, one of the things they focused on was that they wanted Luxembourgish artists to actually take part. So you had to either be a citizen of Luxembourg, you had to originate from the country, or you had to have a strong connection to Luxembourg and its music scene to participate. And to most, this may sound like an ordinary thing. Isn't it like that in most national selections? And I guess it is, but for Luxembourg, this is actually quite a big deal. a lot of their past entrants have not had a Luxembourg citizenship. They've had a lot of participants from France, definitely, and they've also had some from other countries around them, like one of their past winners, Vicky Leandros, is from Greece. This was actually quite common back in the days for Eurovision, especially for some of the smaller countries taking part. Monaco is another good example of a microstate taking part in Eurovision, where oftentimes their artist would have no connection to the country whatsoever. So it's a nice approach to see that they're going for something that feels more authentic, more Luxembourgish. And they really pulled out the big guns with having a big audition process, really spending the money and the time to find the right candidates. And they had some big Eurovision names in there, some big names of recent times, I guess you can say, like someone like Christa Björkman, of course, who has been producing Eurovision and Melodifestivalen for many years. You had someone like a past Eurovision participant, Cesar Samson. You had Israeli television producer Tali Ishkoli. You had Jan Boris, the former head of delegation for Czechia. A lot of these who have really shaped Eurovision for the past couple of years and who has a lot of knowledge on the contest and what does well in modern Eurovision, something that the Luxembourgish broadcaster RTL, of course they don't have that, because like I said, the contest has changed a lot in those 31 years. So they really did take their time to bring in some familiar names and bring in some names that knows what they're talking about, that definitely have that Eurovision vibe over them. They get this contest very well. But I think there's also some signal value in bringing in these big names and say, hey, we really want to do this. I think something that's also really awesome is that they brought someone in like Susanne Georgi. Some of you may know her as the Danish singer from the group Me and My, who were very popular back in the 80s, but she was also the one participating for Andorra in Eurovision back in 2009, and for the past couple of years have really worked hard to bring Andorra back to the Eurovision Song Contest. She hasn't succeeded yet, but being a part of this Luxembourg selection as a vocal coach, that's definitely also, there's a lot of signal value in that. You know, having a country like Luxembourg who has some of the same struggles as Andorra has, being a small country with not a lot of funding in the government, all these things, not a lot of funding for the broadcasters. I think with Susanne being part of the selection as well, that's another way of her for showing the Andorran government that Luxembourg can do it. We can do it as well. So, you know, they really showed what a country can be capable of, maybe even with not the biggest amount of funds, but a love for the contest. And I think that's something that follows through with all this when it comes to the way that they went about selecting their act, the way they went about doing the show itself. All these things really show a love and care for wanting this return to be spectacular. We ended up with 8 fairly unknown acts. I think some of them might have been a little more popular with the local audience, and I definitely saw a few of the names even before the acts were selected, where people were talking about these are some Luxembourg's artists that we would love to see take part. So there were some of them that were a little bit buzz around, but for the most part, I'd say that we went with some fairly unknown acts. Something that I've seen a lot of people talk about is the fact that most of the acts ended up having new songs written for them. They weren't performing the song they initially went in with for the auditions. And I get why people think it's a shame. I do think it's a shame as well, but I get why they're doing this. And I get that mostly because of the people on the jury, the people producing this contest. This is definitely a Eurovision All-Star cast helping Luxembourg, but it also means that it's people who have this perceived idea of what is a Eurovision song. Some of the names that I mentioned earlier, like Christa Björkman or Tali Ishkoli, they are people where you might think of them as some of the ones who are still stuck in the idea of that the thing, a Eurovision song, still exists. And I'm definitely one of those who say that the typical Eurovision style of music, while that may have worked a few years ago, Eurovision is moving in a different direction. It is becoming more of a modern contest. It is becoming more of a relevant contest, which means that we get more popular music in the contest. We get more music that actually is played on the local radio stations, that is actually being played around Europe, that doesn't feel as old and kitsch as it used to. But the 8 songs we ended up with, I wouldn't call them bad. I don't think it's fair to call them bad. but they may just be a little too bland. They aren't really taking any risks. They aren't really trying something different. There isn't a lot of genre diversity in these songs. They are something that you would see ending up in maybe like 5th or 6th place in a semifinal of Melodifestivalen. It's the kind of songs that Denmark has often been criticized for having too many of in the national selections. They are kind of filler songs in a sense. They're easy to listen to and they aren't half bad, but they're nothing groundbreaking. And I don't think they have any chance, none of these songs had a chance of actually going up there and winning Eurovision. Maybe that isn't what they're supposed to do. Maybe RTL doesn't want to win the first year that they are back. Maybe they do want something that's a little bit more laid back, easy listenable, and something that doesn't take too many risks. Maybe it is smart. Maybe it is smart to come with something that feels safe, that has been tried in Eurovision before. Something that may just be able to scrape through the semifinal. I guess only time will tell, but I do get why they went down this route. Now, this national selection was big. In my opinion, it was a bigger production than I really thought they were gonna go for. We've seen some of the smaller national finals, like for example the one we have in Czechia, which comes from countries that have very little budget allocated to Eurovision. But it really seems like RTL went all the way this year. We had a big arena, at least when you keep the country in mind, the size of the country in mind. You had a fabulous stage, great camera angles, 4 presenters. You had all the things of like a mini Eurovision on that stage. The show itself was being produced by Tele-ish Colli Production, an Israeli production company, and in these times, I guess you can say that it is a little bit of a risk going for an Israeli company, especially thinking about the current world situation. But I would imagine that the contract was put in place way before we saw the current situation in Gaza. So I don't know if it's much of an excuse, but I think it's definitely a reason why they went for this company. It is a company and a producer who has worked on Eurovision before, most notably in 2019 in Tel Aviv. So it makes sense. And I don't think when they planned this return, they could have predicted the kind of backlash from the fandom that they did end up having. And of course, also the whole rigging allegations when it comes to the winner. It's not something I want to go into in this video, but I think it was important to at least acknowledge it. The show itself was presented in 2 languages. It was presented in Luxembourg and it was presented in English. Surprisingly, no French in the show. You know, when I think of Eurovision and Luxembourg, I think French. Most of their entries, bar I think 3 or something like that, have actually been in French in the years that they participated. So not having French on the show, that was a little bit of a surprise to me. But if there are anyone watching this video who are more knowledgeable on Luxembourg and the languages that they speak, and maybe French isn't as used anymore, let me know in the comments if you know. But I think the bigger thing to take away here was definitely the fact that half of the show was presented in English. We also had a special stream on the RTL website where you could watch it with English commentary. This very much felt like this was something being done to please the international fans. And in general, that feels like that was a big part of this show. You know, they wanted to create something that of course was fun for the locals, but definitely was a big deal for the fans who have been eagerly waiting for so many years for Luxembourg to return. I'm honestly kind of surprised that they didn't go down the route that we've seen some other countries do this year and actually stream it on the Eurovision website, but maybe they will next year. But it's definitely a trend that we're seeing more of and that I think is very interesting, and I do plan on making a video about on some point. The rise of these more internationally focused national finals. Czechia is probably the best example we have at the moment, where that show very much feels like it's catered just as much, if not more, to the international Eurovision fans than it is to the local audience in Czechia. This show wasn't 100% presented in English, but it was still going down that route. And you know, something like the fact that ESC.vote was also used for the voting, the televoting, which is the same that we also see in Czechia. This was just as much of a fan show as it was a show for RTL Luxembourg. And maybe to some extent it was a little bit too much fan service. I get what they were going for, and again we might have to look at the production behind it and the people behind it. But having all those winners on the show, having all those interval acts, maybe that wasn't necessary. It felt very random and it didn't really feel like there was much of a story into it. You know, they tried to play it off with, oh, we want to celebrate Sweden because they're hosting this year, so here is a random cover of Waterloo that all of our participants are doing. It just felt a little random, and it didn't feel like that there was much thought put into it. Had I been the producer behind this, maybe I would have taken the approach of saying, well, it's been 31 years since we last participated. Let's catch up with Eurovision. And you could use those interval acts with the past winners to say, this is what we have missed as citizens of Luxembourg in those 31 years. But instead, it just felt a little bit messy. And I do believe the show also ran heavily over time. At least the English commentators hinted at the fact that they were well over time when we went to some of the later interval acts. And honestly, I think the interval act that I had the most fun with, that was the more authentic Luxembourg interval act. And of course, it was also nice to see some of those past winners on the stage as well. And even having someone like Desiree, the last presenter of a Eurovision hosted in Luxembourg. Yeah, it was nice to see all those returning. Of course it was, but the show could have maybe cut a little bit shorter, been a little bit more tight, and maybe it would have been a better production. But that's really the only criticism I have there. That and the fact that after one of the acts had confetti on their performance, no one came and wiped the stage, and I still don't get that. For like the past 4 performances or something like that, you still have all that confetti on stage, and I feel like that's a big production error. That just looked stupid. So those are really the only 2 big complaints I have, because I do think at the end of the day, this was a mini Eurovision. This was a great production, and I very much enjoyed the program. In May, we will finally see Luxembourg back on the Eurovision stage. This time, it'll be Tally and her song Fighter. Hopefully for Luxembourg, making sure that they return to that grand final they haven't been in for so many years. I'm not a song reviewer, but I would say that this song is the typical national final song. This doesn't feel like anything new, and it definitely feels like the kind of song that we've heard for the past couple of years. Will it go through? I think it depends on the other songs in the semifinals, so only time will tell. But am I excited about the return of Luxembourg in the contest? Absolutely. This is a big return for Luxembourg, and they really went all out with this selection, way more than I thought they would. It really feels like they take this contest seriously. They want to do well, and they want to produce a show that they can be proud of, and I really respect that. The production may not be as grand next year. You know, over the next couple of years, they may find their place. They may find a style that works for them. It may become more locally sourced, locally produced. But the fact that they do take it seriously, I think means a lot. They really set a good example for what micronations can do at Eurovision. I feel like Luxembourg, together with San Marino, really proved that small nations can and should participate in Eurovision. We definitely need to make Eurovision more accessible to smaller countries. We've seen the participation fee rise heavily over the last couple of years, and it does mean that we're missing a lot of countries this year. But hopefully these smaller countries and their approach to the contest and how they manage to find the funding for it, hopefully it can inspire other countries, and hopefully they can also get a place in the Eurovision reference group, get their voice out there, and make this contest more accessible for micronations, because this is a big deal. Participating in Eurovision can be a big deal, and it can really give small countries a lot. I hope they stay in the contest for many, many years to come, and I really hope they show a great example of how it can be done. And even if they do get a bad result this year, I hope it doesn't scare them away from the contest. I hope they continue fighting for this, and I do think that if they keep up with taking this seriously, really trying to find their right formula, I do think we can see Luxembourg getting that 6th win in a couple of years. And regardless, no matter if they do well or not, it's another country in Eurovision, and the more countries we can get, the better. And this time it's Luxembourg. And if they do well, and if a country like San Marino does well, maybe it will mean that we get more of these micronations in the Eurovision in the next couple of years. Or maybe we'll just see some of those Eastern European countries return because Luxembourg can show them a way of doing it. I've said a lot, and we don't know if this will succeed, but I'm hopeful for the future at least.